Hello and welcome to the first episode of Alf Zoo in 2014. Today we're going to tackle a very interesting problem, and that is the eroding trust of IT. A trust that's been slightly dissipating because of the consumerization trends that we see around us. And why the consumerization trend has been something that has been bandied about by many pundits. Few have done such a good job as my good friend Jon Hall in putting it into real terms. Welcome to the zoo, Jon. I think this is the third time we have you here.
I think so, yeah.
You've written a great piece for Service@360 that talks about how these consumerization trends that we're seeing actually have a direct impact in how we relate and work with IT. Our trust of their recommendation and so on is not necessarily as high as it has been, or maybe it's for the first time we learned that we never really had that much trust in their recommendations. And that is something that is a social phenomenon almost, something that is all around us. You're starting your article very nicely with how Uber has completely changed the taxi industry, for example. An industry which I didn't know was heavily regulated, starting hundreds of years ago. You have the British very famous cabs, you have the American very New Yorker cabs, and people know who they are. But now Uber's really taking a big chunk out of that gap, and we users, consumers of something like Uber, are starting to listen to our peers rather than authorities when we select, in this case, transportation services. What is the point you try to make around how Uber's changed our view of the world?
Uber and services like it are doing something really interesting, which is taking on long-established regulation, and also at the same time they're looking to disrupt long-established service models that we thought were completely commoditized. So when we look at taking a taxi, I mean that's not really changed dramatically in a very long time. We typically put our trust in regulators to ensure that we're getting a service that's run by somebody reputable and that they've got the right insurance and their vehicle is roadworthy. And if you look at the policies of taxi regulators, for example, London, they openly state that the primary objective of this is safety. So it's establishing a level of trust that you're not going to get harmed by the individual or their lack of compliance with the standards they're meant to adhere to. And that's pretty much guaranteed a service. It's not an incentive in itself to excel, you could argue. And I mean, I like to joke that sometimes when you take a taxi here in towns in the UK, the experience tends to be that you phone somebody up and then they lie to you for the next half hour. But even in places like London, there's a little bit more sort of brand and cachet about it. So they'll have the livery taxis we see, the yellow cabs in New York, the black London taxis. And again, you're getting a well-regulated and actually quite well-trained service. But again, it's establishing a safe baseline. You know what you're getting. What Uber are doing to attack that is they're bringing in this sort of element of listening to your peers and not the regulator. So Uber do reinforce the fact that their drivers have to comply with standards to work for them, and they have to have the right insurance and cover. We kind of have to take that at face value, but that face value isn't very prominent anyway. If you go to Uber's website, they don't talk about that. They talk about feedback, and they give examples of 5-star drivers, and they really play the public sourced feedback. And actually, conversely, they also quietly have the drivers rating passengers as a little twist to that. But the important fact is that there's actually a built-in incentive there to really excel. So Uber drivers are well known for kind of handing you a bottle of water and maybe some snacks, and having this real pride in their rating because their rating is their brand. Uber's not so much their personal brand; their rating is their personal brand, and it sort of changes the service model and changes the expectation that customers have of what they're going to get.
Well, you mentioned that this allows Uber to. It changes how they think. They don't try to meet the minimum, they try to strive for the maximum, which is quite a big shift, especially when it comes to service delivery.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's just borrowing a concept that's getting huge on the internet and is really eroding a lot of other sort of monolithic trust providers of the past. You know, we see this example for example with sites like TripAdvisor. So TripAdvisor is going from strength to strength. If you pull the latest annual reports or their quarterly reports, you know, year on year they're going up by tens of percent in revenue, you know, 60, 70% of year on year in visits. And I think I read they were getting more than one review a second now. But at the same time, things like Lonely Planet and established guidebooks are really struggling. Their sales are plummeting. You know, BBC bought Lonely Planet for, I think it was $130 million and have sold them now for $50 million, taking a huge loss. So we're actually seeing this shift from long-established sources of trust on, you know, restaurants in a strange town or hotels to these very sort of dynamic, current crowdsourced models, and it's a very, very dramatic business shift.
These crowdsourced or you know, peer-assisted selection doesn't necessarily instill trust in me. I personally do not find TripIt or many of these reviews very valuable, because the way I see it is there's two types of people who rate product and service. Either those are really, really happy, or those are really, really upset. And if you read carefully many of these reviews, they lack substance beyond a personal experience. And I personally would rather read Lonely Planet. We were in Europe this summer, and I carried my little book with me everywhere, just to make sure I got the right information and wasn't necessarily bamboozled by someone's personal trip. But I seem to be very alone in this case. For example, you personally, do you like reviews when you purchase stuff and services?
It's funny, personally, I've got a shelf full of Lonely Planets, and half of them are places we kind of thought about going, but in the end haven't got round to yet. And to me, they're really good reading and very, very well put together books. But when I travel, particularly for business, you know, I'll be maybe put in a hotel in a city somewhere, and Lonely Planet, or even, you know, if I'm looking for a restaurant, Zagat something like that will still only have a tiny percentage of restaurants. And if it's last year's book, then who's to say that a restaurant hasn't changed ownership or shut down, or that I'm not missing something really cool that's opened up very recently. So I tend to reach for the cell phone and, you know, do the search on what's near me.
Yeah, there's a certain immediacy there that is attractive. I give you that. Now, this trend that we're seeing with crowdsourced and just listening to your peers in general has started to infiltrate the enterprise for a few years now. The bring your own device movement was the beginning of it, but as we become more and more sovereign as individual workers and can almost pick and choose what we want to use as tools, we need to stop listening to IT, at least so you argue, and start to listen more to the buddy next to you who gives much better recommendations than many of the service desk guys have. What type of impact can we see in the business world?
I think bring your own device is clearly a really strong indication that this trend has been creeping into business and IT, you know, in quite a big way. And it partly comes, I think, from a technical tipping point where at some point, you know, everybody started having better devices in their pocket or on their desk at home than in their workspace. But of course, it's exactly what you say. You know, the people are starting to feel they know better. They can get, you know, great consumer information on the kind of devices they can use. There's a lot of word of mouth support for both devices and products. You know, things like Evernote have become very big in business. So that, you know, the Evernote CEO said a year or two ago that he's well aware that 85% of his business users aren't really meant to be using the tool, but it's one of those things that spreads through word of mouth and peer review, and people kind of see a better experience available to them outside. And, you know, IT suddenly finds itself playing the role of the taxi regulator, or perhaps the big brand chain, because one of the things that we see, for example, with restaurants is that the branded chains benefit less than the independents. It's something that Michael Luker, when he did a big study for Harvard Business School on this, he studied Yelp and the effects of Yelp. and talked about the fact that independents get this nice kind of 5-8% revenue kick if their rating goes up. Chains don't see it. So we're kind of, he calls this overcoming the uncertainty barrier, the unfamiliarity barrier. IT is almost in that role where they were, we've been acting as the trusted expert. The thing that we may not get the very greatest, but IT kind of, it is the place to go. The big brand restaurants were the place to go. It was a consistent experience, accountable in its own right. Now we're starting to see that this consumer trend where people have better information, they know other devices, everyone talks about the latest Android phone or what's coming next from Apple, and that's what people want. It's more exciting to them than the idea of liaising with this monolithic provider.
Is this trend rendering IT less relevant? Are they losing their relevancy in the company?
It's an interesting question. I mean, that if you ask, if you ask the IT department, they probably hope to say no and want to retain some degree of control. But I think it certainly changes customers' expectations of how IT listens to them and how each service is kind of ranked and rated. We sort of live in a world where IT will typically do a customer satisfaction survey maybe every 6 months, and that's their data, their own internal thing. Whereas if I go to Amazon and consume a service from Amazon, I can actually, when I, for example, I go to Amazon Marketplace, I can see rankings of the product I'm buying. I can see rankings of, if I go to a third-party supplier through Amazon, we see the price comparison, and that was something that was reckoned was going to be very big on the internet.
Yeah.
Didn't really turn out that way because the trust thing's so important. So we see price comparison right alongside the review of that supplier. And I can drill into any of those reviews, and I can see the reviews of the reviewer as well. So Amazon have actually cleverly pushed the most valid reviews to the top, and that kind of even addresses your point that that there's going to be the kind of crazy angry people or the crazy happy people. Actually, it tends to be the more methodical and thoughtful people who we get to see first. So at every step, I can get a view of what my peers think of that service. So shift that to the enterprise. It makes it very difficult for a department like IT to say, you have to take it this way, this service, this device, because we say so.
Yeah, yeah. What can IT do to overcome this clash?
I think when we look at what we currently do with customer satisfaction, my view is we need to open up and make it more immediate and more current and learn from what's happening right across the consumer space. So maybe we need to give people the opportunity immediately to review their experience and make it more public and open. And perhaps we're even approaching a time where our customers might expect to rank the individual components they're dealing with, the individual people even. So, what IT could possibly do here is follow those principles. Look at what is making sites like Amazon and TripAdvisor and all these other review sites so successful, and embrace that demand. I mean, it's going to be a big cultural shift, I think, for IT to adopt some of these principles.
Yeah, we often have Chris Dancy on this show, and he totally lives by this whole, peer-assisted selection and hoping that more people will embrace it because we create almost a more democratic and more efficient, more human, if you will, interaction with vendors and service providers and so on. You took a step beyond retail and restaurants and so on, and as well as idea. If you look at the world, is this where we're heading? Are we going to start to, is this peer-to-peer connectivity going beyond downloading bad records to become how we make decisions in day-to-day life?
Absolutely, I think it is. I mean, we see it as a huge decision maker in the retail space, which we've talked about. But I'll give you an example that I found very interesting a year or so ago when I had some work done on my house. I had a plasterer in, and we had a whole bunch of stuff done to the house, and about the one good contractor I managed to find, based on, by the way, an old-fashioned kind of review site which someone had compiled. So not a great result from that old-fashioned, individual collated review, curated reviews. But the one really great contractor I had was the plasterer. So I said to him when the job was done, I'd be really happy to provide references for you. You know, you've done a great job. It looks superb. And he immediately said, "Oh, don't worry about that, but I'd really like you to review me on Google."
Really?
So instead of providing, you know, I'd have happily provided a handful of references down the line, and that might have been handy for a couple of his customers. But instead, he wanted that 5-star review up there, so that anybody searching for him would see that.
Mm.
And you know, that's shifting away from the retail space and into the service delivery space.
Mm.
So translate that to a big corporation. I can certainly see, you know, in multi-source kind of environments, it'd be pretty straightforward even now for people to rate their interactions with sort of supplying companies and subcontractors, and really I think companies should be doing that. Otherwise, when you get to the contract renewal and the sales representative from the third-party company is there with your CTO saying, "Oh, we've done a great job," the CTO really needs to know that. That to me is fundamental supplier management. But maybe now we need to learn from these individually ranked interactions and recognize that that's where our user base lives now. Maybe we need to be doing that.
Yeah, maybe one of my friends' experience was the most profound, at least to me. They recently moved to Idaho and was looking for a church to go. And they based it on congregations' reviews of their churches.
Wow.
And that's that they rate their churches. Yes, there's things like how nice is the location, how many activities do they provide for children, how good are the pastors or the preachers, do they do after-school activities, so on. And I'm not myself a church-going man, and I was just baffled. You actually take not necessarily your faith, but where you exercise your faith based on peer reviews. And he said, absolutely, why wouldn't we? And I thought it brought it home to me then that despite my own reservation, this is something that's happening in every corner of the world right now, in every facet of our lives. So it's very interesting to see both the impact in IT management, which we focus on here, but just how that is going to envelop our whole life eventually.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, thank you so much, John. It was a great chat. As always, I appreciate your time. Hopefully we can do this soon again.
Indeed.
Thank you so much, John.
Thanks very much.
For the rest of you out there, take care. Be safe.